Even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream.
Yeah.
It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. Homer Plessy was a shoemaker whose one act of civil disobedience helped inspire future generations of the civil rights movement. He challenged Louisiana's segregation legislation by refusing to move from a whites-only rail car in 1896. At the heart of the case that became Plessy versus Ferguson was a law passed in Louisiana in 1890 providing for separate railway carriages for the white and colored races. It stipulated that all passenger railways had to provide these separate cars, which should be equal in facilities. Homer Plessy, who agreed to be the plaintiff in the case aimed at testing the law's constitutionality, was of mixed race. He described himself as 7/8 Caucasian and 1/8 African blood. On June 7, 1892, Plessy bought a ticket on a train from New Orleans bound for Covington, Louisiana, and took a vacant seat in a whites-only car. After refusing to leave the car at the conductor's insistence, he was arrested and jailed. Then, on May 18, 1896, the Supreme Court of the United States delivered its verdict in Plessy versus Ferguson. In declaring separate but equal facilities constitutional on intrastate railways, the court ruled that the protections of 14th Amendment applied only to political and civil rights, like voting and jury service, not social rights, sitting in the railway car of your choice. In its ruling, the court denied that segregated railway cars for blacks were necessarily inferior. The origin of the phrase Jim Crow has often been attributed to Jump Jim Crow, a song and dance caricature of blacks performed by white actor Thomas D. Rice in blackface, which first surfaced in 1828 and was used to satirize Andrew Jackson's populist policies.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. Over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my own grave and go home to my Lord and be free. No more weeping, don't you know? No
Marcus Garvey wanted to return African Americans to Africa, to create a vibrant black nation, empowered through economic independence. Although some of his goals were controversial, his crusade would inspire leaders from Malcolm X to Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela.
Garvey was certainly a controversial figure, but the concepts that we now think of as black nationalism and black pride started with Garvey's pronouncements.
Marcus Mosiah Garvey was born in St. Ann's Bay, Jamaica, on August 17, 1887. Beginning as a printer's apprentice at 14, Garvey became a union organizer and later worked various jobs across Central America.
Marcus Garvey found wherever he went, black people of African heritage in particular were always on the lower stratification end of society. This had a profound impact on him. Particularly, his concern was for the uplift of African people globally.
In 1912, Garvey sailed to London, England, and took night courses at Birkbeck College. After working for a Pan-African newspaper, Garvey returned to Jamaica in 1914 and formed the United Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA.
The UNIA was about black self-determination. It was about galvanizing the ideas of black repatriation to the motherland, the continent of Africa. And it was extremely important in terms of getting black people to understand self-pride, pride in one's race.
Inspired by Booker T. Washington to raise funds and start his own school, Garvey came to the United States in 1916 and in 1918 began publishing the Negro World newspaper.
Garvey was extremely outspoken. He was, some people would say, almost bombastic. He wanted to take over Africa and had elected himself as president of Africa without consulting the Africans, unfortunately.
Determined to achieve economic independence for African Americans, Garvey launched the Negroes Factories Association in 1919 and a shipping company called the Black Star Line, which he planned to use to transport passengers back to Africa.
Garvey was a great organizer, but unfortunately not a great businessman. During the time that Garvey and the UNIA were trying to launch the Black Star Line, they solicited funds from investors for stock options through the mail. And this resulted later on in allegations of mail fraud, and Garvey was convicted and sent to prison.
After serving 5 years in prison, Garvey was deported. He eventually moved to London, and in 1938, he supported the Greater Liberia Act, created by known white supremacist, Senator Theodore Bilbo from Mississippi.
Marcus Garvey's association with Senator Bilbo is related more on a practical level rather than an intellectual like for each other. Marcus Garvey's attempt to help Africans in America leave and go to Africa fell in line with some aspects of KKK philosophy.
Garvey died in London on June 10, 1940. He was reinterred in Jamaica in 1964 and is hailed as Jamaica's first national hero and the prophet of the Rastafarian religion.
Although Garvey was a flawed leader, he's someone who is really important to the history of the black radical tradition. He was probably one of the strongest voices of black nationalism in history.
On May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court issued its landmark decision in the case of Brown versus Board of Education. The court ruled unanimously that racial segregation in public schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. This decision grew out of several cases that challenged racial segregation in schools across America. Because the lawsuits addressed the same legal questions, The Supreme Court consolidated them into one case. Its lead plaintiff was Oliver Brown. He sued the Topeka, Kansas Board of Education on behalf of his daughter, Linda. She was a black public school student who lived just a few blocks from an elementary school in Topeka. However, she was forced to travel over an hour to reach the all-black school she was assigned to attend. When she tried to enroll in the closer neighborhood school, which was all white, the request was denied. In the U.S. Supreme Court, Brown was represented by NAACP lawyer Thurgood Marshall. He argued that segregated schools were harmful and left black children with feelings of inferiority. The court unanimously decided in Brown's favor, declaring that separate educational facilities were, without exception, unequal. Chief Justice Earl Warren declared that, quote, "In the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place." And while it didn't happen immediately, this ruling paved the way for integration and was a major victory for the civil rights movement.
Called the mother of the civil rights movement, Rosa Parks invigorated the struggle for racial equality when she refused to give up her bus seat to a white man in Montgomery, Alabama. Parks' arrest on December 1, 1955, launched the Montgomery bus boycott by 17,000 black citizens who refused to ride the city's buses in protest over the bus system's policy of racial segregation. Martin Luther King Jr., a Baptist minister who endorsed nonviolent civil disobedience, emerged as leader of the boycott. Montgomery buses each had 36 seats. The first 10 were reserved for whites only. The last 10 seats were theoretically reserved for blacks. The middle 16 seats were first come, first served, with the bus driver retaining the authority to rearrange seats so that whites could be given priority. Parks was sitting in an aisle seat on the front row of the middle section. To her left across the aisle were 2 black women. To her right in the window seat was a black man. A few minutes later, when the bus stopped in front of the Empire Theater, several whites boarded, and driver James Blake noticed a white man standing near the front. He called out for the 4 black passengers in Parks' row to move to the back, where they would have to stand, as all of the seats were now taken. They did not respond. Blake got out of his seat and told the 4 to move, saying, "You all better make it light on yourselves and let me have those seats." 3 of the black passengers moved to the back of the bus. Parks, however, refused to get up, sliding from the aisle seat to the window seat, which would have allowed her for the white passenger to sit in any of the 3 seats in her row. Blake asked, "Are you going to stand up?" Parks looked him in the eye and said, "No." "Well," Blake responded, "I'm going to have you arrested." Officers F.B. Day and D.W. Mixon arrested Parks. "Why do you all push us around?" she asked the cops. Day responded, "I don't know, but the law is the law, and you're under arrest."
August 28, 1963. 250,000 Americans, black and white, young and old, descend on the nation's capital in a show of solidarity. It was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, but it would be remembered as a turning point in the fight for civil rights. Among the speakers, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who electrified the crowd with his stirring "I Have a Dream" speech.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream.
A few months earlier, racial tensions in the Deep South had erupted. News reports carried brutal images of fire hoses blasting at the backs of school children. President Kennedy had finally seen enough. In June of 1963, he presented sweeping civil rights legislation to Congress. Dr. King and others hoped a massive yet peaceful demonstration in Washington would spur passage of the bill. The city braced for violence, but their fears proved unfounded. The day of the march, more than 200,000 people gathered for a rally at the Washington Monument. It was the largest demonstration in the country's history. Arm in arm, they walked from the Washington Monument to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. There, performers as diverse as Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, and Mahalia Jackson lent their voices to the cause. Martin Luther King Jr. was the last to take the stage. He began with a reference to Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves a century earlier.
But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free.
Partway through, King put aside his prepared text and shared with the protesters his dream of equal rights for all.
Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
The local newspaper, the Arkansas Gazette at that time, indicated that the Brown decision was going to change the face of the South forever. I remember those words. And I thought to myself, good, because I think the face of the South ought to change.
I will not force my people to integrate against their will.
The governor of the state, Orville Forbes, decided that he was going to use Central as his point of resistance. None of us of the 9 anticipated that the resistance would be as strong as it was. The night before we were to go to school, the governor called out the Arkansas National Guard, unbeknownst to us. And when we appeared at Central the first day,
Sealed off.
the National Guard was there to bar our entrance and let white students go into the school. What it was like, it was rejection that I had never experienced like that. It seemed to me that if they were going to all of this trouble to keep me out, there was something bigger than my simply going to class. Only when we got home from school that day did we realize what an ordeal, personal ordeal, Elizabeth had gone through, and that she certainly faced more of the mob directly. I always applaud the fact that she was able to keep both her composure and try to figure out how to get out of that. We started school on the 25th of September.
President Eisenhower sends 500 troops of the 101st Airborne Division of the United States Army.
It was a terrific feeling that President of the United States would send troops to escort us into school. I didn't know what was going to happen after that. It was like going to war every day. You had students who tried to use as much verbiage as they could to intimidate us. We had threats and comments that, we would be killed. For all of us, we decided that this was a year that we were going to support each other. We were going to try to do as well as we could in our academic work. Some were a lot smarter than me, but I also was determined that this year I was going to graduate from Central. The principal of the school told me at one point along the way that I didn't have to come to the ceremony. They would mail me my diploma. And I thought, listen, I didn't go through all this to pass up the ceremony. Maybe the world thought that after Little Rock, everything is going to be fixed. And one of the important pieces, I'm sure I don't need it to remind anyone, that the history of slavery in this country makes it very difficult to overcome a lot of issues on race. We're a long way from being perfect, but we certainly are not what we were when I started out. I believe that our participation at Central is one of those many steps that's gone to change this country for the better.
It's an iconic image of the American civil rights movement, one that's been reprinted in newspapers and history books over the last 50 years. In the forefront, a 15-year-old girl named Elizabeth Eckford is being hurled insults at by a white mob behind her as she is denied entrance to the school. Just behind her, also 15 years old, was another young woman whose face is contorted with anger. That young woman's name was Hazel Bryan, and her face became the face that symbolized segregation in the southern United States. On the morning of September 4th, 1957, Eckford was to join 8 other students, a group that was later to be known as the Little Rock Nine, to become the first black students to enroll at the all-white Little Rock Central High School. Because she did not have a phone in her home, Eckford never received a call from Daisy Bates, the head of the Arkansas chapter of the NAACP, telling the students to come to her house prior to heading to school. So that morning, Eckford went directly to the school alone. Once there, she encountered the screaming mob of white people and the Arkansas National Guard, set in place by Governor Orville Forbes, to prevent the black students from entering the school. When the rest of the group arrived, they too were all turned away from the school. Finally, on September 24th, President Eisenhower sent in the 101st Airborne Division of the United States Army to accompany them inside the building, and the 9 students were formally able to begin attending classes. Hazel Bryan's parents pulled her from the newly integrated Central High School and instead enrolled her in a rural school closer to her home. However, she dropped out a year later to get married. In the early 1960s, Hazel picked up the Little Rock directory and looked under Eckford. Then, without telling anyone of her actions, dialed the number. "I am that girl," she told Elizabeth, and told her how sorry she was. In the passage of time, the pair would draw closer together, once appearing on Oprah together, another time for a 40-year reunion photograph. Then at other times, mistrust and suspicion would lead to separation. Hazel never stopped thinking about the picture and making amends for it. She severed what had been her ironclad ties to an intolerant church. She taught mothering skills to unmarried black women and took underprivileged black teenagers on field trips. She'd argue with her mother on racial topics, defending relatives who intermarried. Secretly, Hazel always hoped some reporter would track her down and write about how she changed. But it didn't happen on its own, and she did nothing to make it happen. Instead, again and again, there was the picture. Anniversary after anniversary, Martin Luther King Day after Martin Luther King Day. It just kept popping up. The world of race relations was changing, but to the world, she never did.
On February 9th, 1960, A bomb exploded at a home in Little Rock, Arkansas, where Carlotta Walls lived. She was one of the black students that was known as the Little Rock Nine. Carlotta was the youngest of the group. In September 1957, the Little Rock Nine entered Central High School on orders of a federal court to desegregate the school. But they were met by angry crowds, and the Arkansas National Guard even blocked their entry. Eventually, President Eisenhower sent federal troops in and commanded the Arkansas National Guard to escort the black students to school. Carlotta Walls described the integration experience as, quote, painful. She recalled that her white classmates fell into three groups: those who tormented her and the other black students, those who sympathized with them, and those who silently ignored the way they were treated. 4 weeks before graduation, a bomb exploded at the Walls family home. Carlotta, her mother, and her sister were inside, but no one was injured. Police initially arrested Carlotta's father. They beat him, but were unable to pressure him into confessing to the crime. Police later arrested two young black men. One of them was a family friend. While Carlotta never believed either of the men was responsible, both were convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. In June 1962, a United States Court of Appeals ordered the University of Mississippi to admit James Meredith. It would take numerous attempts that year before the 29-year-old Air Force veteran and Mississippi native would become the first black student at Ole Miss. Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett, a segregationist, personally blocked Meredith's first two attempts to enroll. Mississippi's lieutenant governor stopped his third attempt. Meredith's fourth attempt sparked violent riots, which left 2 people dead and several injured. On October 1st, 1962, federal marshals sent by President John F. Kennedy successfully escorted Meredith to enroll. They also accompanied him to classes. While Meredith gained entrance into the school, he didn't gain acceptance. Students were told it was their constitutional right to refuse to socialize or fraternize with an undesirable student. Meredith would endure ongoing isolation, harassment, and violence. Even his family was targeted. A bullet fired into his home nearly injured his teenaged sister. Despite the hostility, Meredith remained steadfast, and on August 18, 1963, became the first black to graduate from the University of Mississippi, earning a degree in political science.
On September 9, 1957, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed into law the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Originally proposed by Attorney General Herbert Brownell, the act marked the first occasion since Reconstruction that the federal government undertook significant legislative action to protect civil rights. Although influential Southern congressmen whittled down the bill's initial scope, it still included a number of important provisions for the protection of voting rights. It established the Civil Rights Division in the Justice Department and empowered federal officials to prosecute individuals that conspired to deny or abridge another citizen's right to vote. Moreover, it also created a 6-member U.S. Civil Rights Commission charged with investigating allegations of voter infringement. But perhaps most importantly, the Civil Rights Act of 1957 signaled a growing federal commitment to the cause of civil rights.
Today on the Daily Dose, the Greensboro Four makes civil rights history. When 4 black college students refused to vacate a whites-only lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, the civil rights sit-in movement of 1960 would spread across the South like wildfire, elevating the civil rights movement to a new level of national awareness. Influenced heavily by Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolent protest philosophy, Ezell Blair Jr., David Richmond, Franklin McCain, and Joseph McNeil refused to vacate a Woolworth lunch counter after they were refused service for the color of their skin. All 4 were students from the nearby North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College, while their activist agenda was further inspired by the Freedom Riders, who tested the clout of the Supreme Court's recent decision banning segregation on interstate bus travel. Other underlying motivation came from the brutal 1955 murder of Emmett Till, who had allegedly whistled at a white woman in a Mississippi store. Assisted by local white businessman Ralph Jones, on February 1, 1960, the 4 students sat down at the lunch counter at Woolworth's, where the official policy was to refuse service to anyone but whites. When the 4 young men refused to leave, police were called to the scene, but were unable to take any action due to the complete lack of provocation on the part of the 4 students. By that time, Johns had alerted local media, who arrived in full force to cover the events on television. The 4 stayed until the store closed for the night, returning the next day with more student activists from other local colleges. By February 5th, some 300 students had joined the protest at Woolworth's, paralyzing the lunch counter and other downtown businesses. Heavy television coverage of the Greensboro sit-ins sparked a sit-in movement that spread rapidly to college towns throughout the South and then up into the North, as young blacks and whites joined in various forms of peaceful protest against segregationist policies, including libraries, beaches, hotels, and other whites-only establishments. While white pushback was frequently contentious, by the end of March, the movement had spread to 55 cities in 13 states, forcing previously segregated enterprises to quietly integrate by the summer of 1960. Today, the former Greensboro Woolworths, where the first sit-in took place, now houses the International Civil Rights Center and Museum, which features a restored version of the lunch counter where the Greensboro Four first sat, while part of the original lunch counter is now on display at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. And there you have it. The Greensboro Four moves civil rights to a national stage. Today on the Daily Dose. Get your nerd on.
We deal with violence every day in the South. They didn't treat us like we were human. They treated us like vicious animals. Like they were always on guard, thinking that we're gonna do something to them while they were doing it to us. When I came to Nashville in 1960, I immediately sought out the people in the civil rights movement. When I first went to the meeting, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Bernard Lafayette got up and said that we would defeat this evil system of segregation with nonviolence and passive resistance. I had never heard of passive resistance. I knew violence because you're raised to be violent. You know, if your mom and your daddy tells you somebody hit you, you hit them back.
I did not grow up being nonviolent. I had a very short fuse. It was very obvious to me that segregation was wrong. I had been raised in the church. My parents had taught me right from wrong, and I wanted to do something. I just wasn't sure whether I could be nonviolent.
I believed in protecting myself. And so to be now told that somebody's going to slap me or spit on me or throw water on me and I'm not to do anything about it is against my human nature. So I had to understand why I had to certainly not give in to that impulse to defend myself.
May I have a cup of coffee, please?
Now, look, I don't want any niggers in here. I don't want
What are you doing in here? Don't you know?
The training that we did in Washington, D.C. prior to the time the writers got on the buses was largely devoted to trying to see how the person is going to react.
Are you with this fella?
Why, yes, we're both interstate bus passengers.
Where are you from?
I'm from the United States.
The requirement for nonviolence was not that they believed in nonviolence. It was simply that they acted in a nonviolent way.
I wanted so bad to be a part of the movement because I hated segregation so much. I wanted to help change the system. I decided to go along with the program. So I joined the nonviolent movement.
It's remarkable that during the rides themselves, they remained nonviolent. There was an absolute ability to control themselves.
I did not believe in nonviolence, but it worked. We had to do it this way because we needed the sympathy of good-hearted white people who were on the fence, so to speak. And we needed the participation of whites. And when you see a black person being set upon by 4 or 5 whites, and this person isn't fighting back, it is easier to sympathize with that black person. If we had fought back, many of us would have been killed. And the small reservoir of sympathy that we would have had for whites standing on the sideline would have vanished.
This nonviolence thing fascinated people. The reality that it could bring about change and constructive change, to me, is what really was the difference and the ultimate impact of the freedom rides.
They understood that the only way it could be done in America is through peaceful methods. And the freedom rides illustrated that. The people who got beaten did not strike back. The people who got beaten did not have weapons with them. It was just a stroke of genius.
August 28, 1963. 250,000 Americans, black and white, young and old, descend on the nation's capital in a show of solidarity. It was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, but it would be remembered as a turning point in the fight for civil rights. Among the speakers, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who electrified the crowd with his stirring "I Have a Dream" speech.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream.
A few months earlier, racial tensions in the Deep South had erupted. News reports carried brutal images of fire hoses blasting at the backs of school children. President Kennedy had finally seen enough. In June of 1963, he presented sweeping civil rights legislation to Congress. Dr. King and others hoped a massive yet peaceful demonstration in Washington would spur passage of the bill. The city braced for violence, but their fears proved unfounded. The day of the march, more than 200,000 people gathered for a rally at the Washington Monument. It was the largest demonstration in the country's history. Arm in arm, they walked from the Washington Monument to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. There, performers as diverse as Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, and Mahalia Jackson lent their voices to the cause. Martin Luther King Jr. was the last to take the stage. He began with a reference to Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves a century earlier.
But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free.
Partway through, King put aside his prepared text and shared with the protesters his dream of equal rights for all.
Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
The Civil Rights Act of 1866. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 declared all male persons born in the United States to be citizens, without distinction of race or color or previous condition of slavery or involuntary servitude. Although President Andrew Johnson vetoed the legislation, that veto was overturned by the 39th United States Congress.
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of equality for all men that began with Lincoln and the Civil War 100 years ago. The Negro won his freedom then. He wins his dignity now. 5 hours after the House passes the measure, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is signed at the White House by President Johnson. Before an audience of legislators and civil rights leaders who had labored long and hard for passage of the bill, President Johnson calls for all Americans to back what he calls a turning point in history.
As a prerequisite to vote.
We must not approach the observance and enforcement of this law in a vengeful spirit. Its purpose is not to punish.
The Fair
Its
Housing
purpose
Act
is not
of
to divide,
1968.
but
The
to
Fair
end
Housing
divisions.
Act of 1968
Divisions which have
prohibited
lasted all too
discrimination
long.
concerning the sale,
Its purpose
rental,
is national,
and financing
not
of
regional.
housing based on race,
This Civil
religion,
Rights Act is a
national
challenge
origin, or
to all of
sex.
us
The Fair
to
Housing
go to work
Act
in our
stands as the
communities
final
and our
great
states, in our
legislative
homes and in
achievement
our
of the
hearts,
Civil Rights era.
to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country. So, tonight I urge every public official, every religious leader, every business and professional man, every working man, every housewife, I urge every American to join in this effort to bring justice and hope to all our people and to bring peace to our land.
There's warm applause from members of both parties as the president sets to work. It is work. He uses nearly 100 pens to affix his signature and date. Souvenirs go to Republican leader Everett Dirksen and Democratic whip Hubert Humphrey. The president seems to have mastered the art of just touching each pen to the paper.
I'm walking and talking with my mind.
The integration leader, Martin Luther King, receives his pen, a gift he said he would cherish. The Department of Justice will enforce the law if necessary. And G-Man Chief, J. Edgar Hoover, is present. Another group of pens is reserved for the Kennedys, and the Attorney General is entrusted with a half dozen. Now, in this summer of 1964, the Civil Rights Bill is the...
There ain't nothing wrong with keeping my mind stayed on freedom. Oh, there ain't no harm in keeping my mind, hey, stayed on freedom. There ain't no harm in keeping your mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah. I'm singing and praying with my mind.
New Jersey became a city of race riots, violence, looting, and hate. For 5 days, it was a battleground and a looter's paradise. Colored citizens clashed with police, National Guardsmen, and state troopers. 24 people were killed and 1,200 injured. Nearly half the city was in the grip of terror. The Newark flare-ups sparked similar riots in other American centers, with hatred near danger point between white and black extremist groups. In Newark, there was an uneasy tension, punctuated by minor outbreaks of violence after 5 days of bloody fighting. From rooftops and windows, snipers picked their targets. The toll of dead and injured tells its own tragic story. Damage runs into millions of dollars. With the coming of the long, hot summers, for 3 years, America has had to face the tragic consequences of riots stemming from the slums of cities stretching right across the nation. Negroes claim they have waited long enough for equal rights. Militant leaders of some urge violence as the answer. This was one example.
The March on Washington, August 28, 1963. Arguably one of the most famous events of the Civil Rights Movement took place on August 28, 1963, the March on Washington. It was organized and attended by civil rights leaders such as A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, and Martin Luther King, Jr.
August 28, 1963. 250,000 Americans, black and white, young and old, descend on the nation's capital in a show of solidarity. It was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, but it would be remembered as a turning point in the fight for civil rights. Among the speakers, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., who electrified the crowd with his stirring "I Have a Dream" speech.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream.
A few months earlier, racial tensions in the Deep South had erupted. News reports carried brutal images of fire hoses blasting at the backs of school children. President Kennedy had finally seen enough. In June of 1963, he presented sweeping civil rights legislation to Congress. Dr. King and others hoped a massive yet peaceful demonstration in Washington would spur passage of the bill. The city braced for violence, but their fears proved unfounded. The day of the march, more than 200,000 people gathered for a rally at the Washington Monument. It was the largest demonstration in the country's history. Arm in arm, they walked from the Washington Monument to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. There, performers as diverse as Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, and Mahalia Jackson lent their voices to the cause. Martin Luther King Jr. was the last to take the stage. He began with a reference to Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves a century earlier.
But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free.
Partway through, King put aside his prepared text and shared with the protesters his dream of equal rights for all.
Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
On March 7, 1965, the civil rights movement in Alabama took an especially violent turn, as 600 peaceful demonstrators participated in the Selma to Montgomery March to protest the killing of a black civil rights activist, Jimmy Lee Jackson, by a white police officer, and to encourage legislation to enforce the 15th Amendment. As the protesters neared the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were blocked by Alabama state and local police, sent by Alabama Governor George C. Wallace, a vocal opponent of desegregation. Refusing to stand down, protesters moved forward and were viciously beaten and tear-gassed by police, and dozens of protesters were hospitalized. The entire incident was televised and became known as Bloody Sunday. Some activists wanted to retaliate with violence, but King pushed for nonviolent protests and eventually gained federal protection for another march. As African Americans gained new access to white-dominated institutions, the freedom struggle moved inside from the streets. On college campuses, black students fought for and won the creation of Afro-American studies programs and financial aid policies that would allow children of lower-income families to get college educations. In the military, one of the largest employers of African Americans, affirmative action and other policies produced one of the most racially equitable workplaces in the nation. Indeed, the only one in which whites routinely have black supervisors. And just about every occupation, from auto work to librarianship, black caucuses arose to create a safe space where members would no longer be lonely tokens. They could raise consciousness about white privilege and organize for fair treatment and other institutional changes. The Congressional Black Caucus was only the best publicized and most influential of these. Created in 1969 by Shirley Chisholm and others, it joined together a new critical mass of African American representatives as it enabled them to speak with a common voice on issues of concern to their constituents.